It was a foggy December night in 1999. 3 different airplanes came within seconds of a collision that could have rivaled the worst disaster in aviation history. No radar warning went off, no alarm blared through the cockpit, just a wrong turn, a confused radio call, and a controller who refused to believe what her own pilots were telling her. This is Replay Vault, and today we're heading to a small regional airport in Rhode Island, where a routine landing turned into one of the closest calls in modern American aviation. If stories like this keep you hooked, make sure you're subscribed because we're about to walk through every single second of what happened to United Airlines Flight 1448. The date was December 6, 1999. The location was Theodore Francis Green State Airport, just outside Providence, Rhode Island. It's not a massive international hub like JFK or Chicago O'Hare. It's a smaller regional airport, the kind that handles a steady flow of domestic flights rather than constant heavy international traffic. But on this particular night, that airport would become the stage for a near miss involving 3 separate aircraft, all within the span of just a few minutes. United 1448 was a Boeing 757, a mid-sized twin-engine airliner that was, and still is, one of the most common workhorses in American commercial aviation. It had just landed safely on runway 5R. The landing itself was completely uneventful. No mechanical issues, no turbulence, nothing dramatic, just another routine touchdown at the end of a routine flight. But the weather outside that night was far from ideal. Fog had rolled in across the airport, thick enough to cut visibility down to roughly 400 meters. Picture trying to navigate a maze of taxiways and runways where you can barely see beyond a few hundred meters in any direction. Now picture doing that at night, in an unfamiliar layout, relying almost entirely on what the tower tells you over the radio. That's the situation the crew of United 1448 found themselves in the moment their wheels touched the runway. Once they'd landed, the air traffic control tower gave them their taxi instructions. They were told to exit the runway to the left. From there, they were to taxi toward the gate using 2 specific taxiways. Along the way, they would need to cross another runway, runway 16. On paper, it sounds simple enough. In zero visibility, at night, on an airport layout the crew wasn't deeply familiar with, it was anything but simple. Here's where we need to slow down because this is the moment that changes everything. Somewhere in that maze of taxiways in the fog, in the dark, the flight crew of United 1448 got turned around. Instead of following their cleared route toward the gate, they made a wrong turn, and that wrong turn sent them right back toward the very runway they had just landed on. Runway 5R, the same active runway that other aircraft were still using for departures. Now, at most major airports today, this kind of mistake would likely be caught almost instantly. Modern airports use something called ASDE, Airport Surface Detection Equipment, a radar system that lets air traffic controllers see the exact position of every aircraft and vehicle moving across the ground, even in zero visibility. But in 1999, at Theodore Francis Green Airport, that technology simply wasn't in place. The tower had no ground radar at all. Controllers had to rely almost entirely on what pilots told them over the radio, combined with whatever they could actually see with their own eyes through the fog. And on a night like this, visibility from the tower was severely limited to. So while United 1448 was quietly drifting back toward an active runway, completely unaware of exactly where they were, the controller in the tower had no independent way to confirm their position. She was essentially flying blind right alongside them, forced to trust radio calls from a crew that was itself disoriented. This is the exact kind of gap in the system that safety experts had been warning about for years. A blind spot where human error on the ground could combine with a lack of technology to create real danger. Completely unaware that United 1448 was heading back onto the runway, the tower controller cleared another aircraft for takeoff. This was FedEx Flight 1662, a Boeing 727 cargo aircraft, cleared to depart from runway 5R. The exact same runway United 1448 was now approaching from the taxiway side. From the tower's perspective, everything looked normal. The runway was supposedly clear. There was no reason not to send FedEx 1662 rolling down that runway and into the night sky. But it wasn't clear. United 1448 was creeping closer to that very runway, confused about exactly where they were, still trying to figure out their position in the fog. And then, right as FedEx 1662 was lifting off the ground, gathering speed and climbing away, the 2 aircraft came dangerously close to each other. The cargo jet roared directly over the top of the passenger aircraft, missing it by a margin that, in aviation terms, is uncomfortably close. Inside the cockpit of United 1448, The pilots realized almost immediately what had just happened. Over the radio, one of them said that somebody had just taken off right over them. It was a moment of pure adrenaline. It was the kind of split second where a flight crew suddenly understands they've come far closer to disaster than anyone in that cockpit ever wants to be. And here's where the story takes an even more unsettling turn. Instead of immediately grasping the seriousness of what the United crew was reporting, the controller in the tower initially pushed back. She told them that they shouldn't even be anywhere near the area they were describing. In other words, the controller didn't believe her own pilots when they said an aircraft had just taken off directly above them. Try to imagine being in that cockpit for a moment. You just landed safely. You think you're following your taxi instructions correctly, and suddenly a cargo jet roars past, just overhead, close enough that everyone on board notices it. You report it to the tower, expecting concern and expecting clarity. Instead, you're told that you must be mistaken about where you even are. The confusion didn't end there. As United 1448 continued trying to figure out their exact position, they radioed in near a specific taxiway intersection. The controller again expressed doubt, insisting they couldn't possibly be where they said they were. Meanwhile, the actual layout of the airport was working against everyone involved because the runway designations at Providence at the time were easy to mix up in poor visibility. One runway could easily be confused for another simply because of how similarly they were labeled. At one point, the United 1448 crew radioed that they believed they were sitting on an inactive runway, only to correct themselves moments later and clarify that they were, in fact, on the active one. That kind of back and forth, a flight crew unsure of their own position on the airport surface, at night, in the fog, is one of the more chilling details of this entire event. These were experienced professional pilots. This wasn't a case of carelessness, it was a case of an environment that had stripped away almost every normal visual reference point a pilot would typically rely on. And then, almost unbelievably, the situation escalated even further. While United 1448 sat at the intersection of that active runway, still trying to confirm their location and still insisting to the tower that they were somewhere they shouldn't be, the controller cleared yet another aircraft for takeoff on that very same runway. This time it was Metrojet Flight 2998, a Boeing 737 operated under the US Airways brand. This is the moment where the entire trajectory of the story shifts, because up until now, every mistake had been compounding on the last one. A wrong turn led to a runway incursion. A runway incursion led to a takeoff clearance issued in error. That error nearly caused a collision with FedEx 1662. And now the tower was doing it again, clearing a second aircraft to take off on a runway that the pilots of United 1448 were insisting, correctly, was not clear at all. But this time, someone broke the chain. The flight crew of Metrojet 2998 had been listening to the confusing radio exchanges building up over the previous minutes. They had heard United 1448 insisting they were on an active runway. They had heard the controller pushing back and denying it. And instead of simply trusting the clearance they had just been given, the Metrojet crew made a decision that would later be credited with preventing a potential catastrophe. They refused the takeoff clearance. Over the radio, they told the tower plainly that they intended to stay clear of every runway until the confusion had been sorted out. It was a calm, deliberate, almost quietly defiant decision made by a flight crew who trusted their own situational awareness over an instruction coming from the one person whose entire job was to have the clearest picture of what was happening at that airport. Remarkably, the tower controller cleared Metrojet 2998 for takeoff a second time, seemingly still not grasping the danger that was unfolding right in front of her. And once again, the Metrojet crew refused, holding their position and unwilling to move until they had real confirmation that the runway was actually safe. It's hard to overstate how significant that decision was. In the heat of the moment, under pressure from air traffic control, plenty of crews might have simply followed the clearance and trusted the system to have done its job correctly. This crew didn't. Only once United 1448 had finally been confirmed to have made it safely to the gate, fully off the runway and out of danger, did Metrojet 2998 finally accept its takeoff clearance and depart. By that point, the entire episode had unfolded over the course of just a few tense minutes, but those minutes contained enough compounding errors to have ended in tragedy multiple times over. When the dust settled, incredibly, no one was hurt. No aircraft sustained any damage. 205 people had been aboard the aircraft involved that night. Every single one of them walked away without ever fully realizing just how close they had come to being part of a very different kind of story. The National Transportation Safety Board opened an investigation almost immediately. Incidents like this, Runway incursions involving multiple aircraft and a near collision are taken extremely seriously. The ingredients present that night: poor visibility, a confusing airport layout, a lack of ground radar, and breakdowns in communication between pilots and controllers are the exact same ingredients that have caused some of the deadliest accidents in aviation history. If that combination sounds familiar, it should. It echoes, in miniature, some of the same underlying conditions that contributed to the worst runway disaster the world has ever seen. Decades earlier, at Tenerife, two fully loaded Boeing 747s collided on a fog-covered runway after a tragic chain of miscommunication. Nobody died at Providence that night, but aviation safety investigators don't wait for a body count to take an incident seriously. They look at how close something came to disaster, and they treat that as seriously as if it had actually happened. The investigation ultimately found that the controller working that night was not at fault in the traditional sense. However, she was required to undergo retraining before she could return to operational duty. It's an important distinction in how aviation safety investigations typically work. It's rarely about punishing one individual for a single mistake. It's about understanding how an entire system, including procedures, technology, training, and communication protocols, allowed a string of small errors to nearly cascade into something catastrophic. In the years that followed, incidents like this one became part of a much larger national push to address runway safety across the United States. By the late 1990s, runway incursions had been steadily increasing across the country. Regulators were already deeply concerned about exactly this kind of scenario. Aircraft were ending up where they shouldn't be, and controllers were working without the ground radar tools needed to catch those mistakes in time. Providence's incident became one more piece of evidence, reinforcing just how urgently airports across the country needed better surface detection technology, and not just at the busiest hubs, but at smaller regional airports too, where the absence of that technology could be just as dangerous. There's also something worth thinking about in how this event actually got resolved. It wasn't a piece of advanced technology that saved everyone that night. It wasn't some backup safety system automatically kicking in. It was two pilots on a Boeing 737 listening carefully to a chaotic sequence of radio calls. They pieced together on their own that something was deeply wrong, and twice they chose to disobey a direct clearance from air traffic control because their own judgment told them it wasn't safe. That's a detail that often gets lost when people talk about near misses like this one. We often imagine aviation safety as something purely mechanical: sensors, radar, automated systems designed to catch human error before it turns fatal. And a lot of the time, that's exactly how it works. But on this particular night in Providence, the final safeguard wasn't a piece of equipment at all. It was human judgment. Deliberate, and unwilling to simply follow instructions when something didn't add up. It's also worth remembering just how disorienting fog can be for a flight crew navigating unfamiliar ground. Pilots spend the vast majority of their training with their instincts built around flying, instruments, and the sky. Taxiing across the ground at night in conditions where you can only see a few hundred meters ahead strips away almost every visual cue a person would normally rely on. Airports look completely different in dense fog than they do in daylight. Signs that would be obvious on a clear day can be missed entirely. Intersections that seem simple on a diagram become genuinely disorienting in real life, especially under the pressure of trying to get to the gate promptly after a long flight. None of that excuses what happened, but it does help explain how professional and experienced pilots ended up exactly where they shouldn't have been, not through carelessness, but through an environment that made a wrong turn dangerously easy to make. What makes this story so gripping isn't just the near collision itself, it's the layers of near misses stacked on top of one another, one compounding into the next, each one representing another chance for the whole sequence to end differently. A wrong turn in the fog, a controller without ground radar to catch it, a takeoff clearance issued in genuine ignorance of the danger, a near collision passing within an uncomfortably close margin overhead, a controller doubting her own pilots not once, but repeatedly, and then finally, a second flight crew listening closely enough and confident enough in their own judgment to simply say no. Every one of those moments could have gone differently if the fog had been just slightly worse, if the Metrojet crew had been distracted, if they had been less attentive to the radio chatter building around them, if FedEx 1662 had rotated for takeoff just a few seconds later, or if United 1448 had drifted just a little farther onto the runway before stopping. Aviation safety, in stories like this, often comes down to margins far smaller than most passengers ever realize: seconds, feet, and a single decision made under pressure that could easily have gone the other way. In the decades since, Providence's runway layout itself changed as a direct result of the confusion that night. One of the runways involved was eventually decommissioned and repurposed as a taxiway. That change removed at least one source of the confusion that had contributed to the crew's disorientation in the first place. It's a small, quiet footnote to the story, but it's also a reminder of how aviation safety actually improves over time. Not through some single dramatic overhaul, but through hundreds of small corrections, each one traced directly back to a night like this one, where the system came far closer to failing than most people would ever want to know. So when you think about United 1448, don't just think about the fog, or the wrong turn, or even the aircraft that missed each other by a frighteningly small margin. Think about the moment a crew on a completely different flight decided that following instructions blindly wasn't good enough. They decided that their own eyes, ears, and judgment mattered more than a clearance they weren't confident in. That decision was made twice, under pressure, in the middle of genuine confusion, and it is very likely the reason this story ends with everyone walking away safely instead of becoming one of the darkest chapters in aviation history. Let's talk for a moment about why runway incursions like this one are considered one of the most serious categories of risk in all of commercial aviation, even when, like this case, nobody actually gets hurt. A mid-air collision, terrifying as it sounds, at least gives both aircraft some room to maneuver, some altitude to work with, some fraction of a second for evasive action. A collision on the ground, especially on an active runway, offers almost none of that. To aircraft moving at high speed, one taking off and one potentially crossing or sitting in its path, have almost no margin for error and almost no way to avoid each other once they're both committed. That's exactly why the FAA and international aviation bodies treat runway incursions with such seriousness. It's not about what happened, it's about what almost happened, and how easily it could have gone the other way. To really appreciate how close this came to disaster, it helps to understand the physics of what a departing aircraft is actually doing in those first few seconds after brake release. A Boeing 727 like the FedEx cargo jet, involved that night, needs a specific, calculated distance to accelerate to what is called rotation speed. That is the point at which the pilots pull back and the aircraft begins to lift off the ground. Right up until that moment, and for several seconds afterward, while the aircraft is still low and still building climb performance, it has very limited ability to change course quickly. It can't simply swerve around an obstacle the way a car might. It's committed to a narrow corridor of sky directly above the runway centerline. Its engines are climbing as efficiently as possible. The crew's full attention is focused on airspeed, pitch, and the initial climb. If another aircraft happens to be sitting anywhere near that corridor during those critical seconds, there is remarkably little either crew can do about it. This is part of why the vertical and lateral separation between FedEx 1662 and United 1448 that night mattered so much. Even though, technically, no collision occurred, the two aircraft passed close enough to each other that the event was treated as a serious near miss and not a minor procedural slip. When investigators reconstruct events like this, they don't just ask whether a collision happened, they ask how many individual safeguards would have needed to fail, one after another, for a collision to actually occur. And in this case, the honest answer was uncomfortably few. It's also worth understanding just how much pressure exists on a controller working a night shift like this one, especially at a smaller airport without the staffing levels or technology available at a major international hub. A single controller in a tower like Providence's is often responsible for sequencing arrivals, departures, and ground movements more or less simultaneously, especially during periods when multiple aircraft are converging on the airport at once. Under normal circumstances, with clear visibility and a straightforward traffic flow, that workload is manageable. Add in fog thick enough to make visual confirmation from the tower nearly useless. Add in an unfamiliar aircraft that has wandered off its assigned taxi route. Add in a growing sense of urgency to keep other flights moving on schedule, and that workload becomes a genuine cognitive strain, the kind that can lead a controller to lean on assumptions rather than confirmed facts, simply because there isn't enough time to double-check everything and still keep the operation moving. That doesn't excuse what happened when the controller repeatedly doubted the United 1448 crew's own description of their location, but it does help explain it. Human beings under pressure tend to default to the version of reality that matches their existing mental model, especially when they're juggling multiple aircraft and limited visual confirmation. The controller's mental model at that moment was that United 1448 had already cleared the runway system and was somewhere out along its assigned taxi route. Every radio call that contradicted that model had to fight against an assumption that had already been formed, and in high-pressure environments, Updating an assumption in real time, especially one that implies you've made a serious mistake, is far harder than it sounds from the outside. This is actually one of the most well-documented phenomena in aviation human factors research, sometimes referred to as confirmation bias under operational stress. It isn't unique to air traffic controllers. Pilots experience it too. Mechanics experience it too. And it shows up again and again in accident investigations across every corner of aviation. Once someone forms a belief about what's happening based on incomplete information, new information that contradicts that belief tends to get explained away rather than fully absorbed, at least until the evidence becomes undeniable. In this case, the evidence became undeniable the moment FedEx 1662 passed directly over United 1448, but by then, the danger had already come and gone. What's remarkable is that the exact same psychological trap nearly repeated itself moments later. The controller cleared Metrojet 2998 for takeoff on the same runway while still operating under the belief that United 1448 wasn't actually where its crew insisted it was. This is precisely why the Metrojet crew's decision carries so much weight in how this story gets told. They weren't relying on a mental model built earlier in the evening. They were relying on what they were hearing in real time, directly from the radio, and they trusted that information over an official clearance. That's an unusually difficult thing to do in a professional environment built around following instructions from air traffic control, where clearances are treated correctly, as authoritative almost all of the time. It's worth pointing out that refusing a takeoff clearance isn't something pilots do lightly, and it isn't something that happens often. The entire system of commercial aviation depends on a basic level of trust between flight crews and air traffic controllers. A trust that, in the vast majority of cases, works exactly as intended, guiding thousands of aircraft safely through crowded airspace and busy airports every single day without incident. Second-guessing that system requires a pilot to override the normal chain of authority based purely on their own situational awareness, and to be willing to accept the consequences if it later turns out they were wrong. In this case, they weren't wrong, and their willingness to trust their own judgment over a direct instruction is a big part of why this story has a survivable ending. In the aftermath, this incident became part of a broader conversation happening across the aviation industry throughout the 1990s. Regulators had already identified runway incursions as a growing national concern in the years leading up to this event, and incidents like the one at Providence added real weight to that concern, because it demonstrated exactly how a lack of ground radar technology could allow a dangerous situation to develop and escalate without controllers having any independent way to catch it early. In the years that followed, airports across the country gradually began adopting improved surface detection systems, giving controllers a far clearer radar-based picture of exactly where every aircraft and vehicle was located on the ground, even in zero visibility conditions. It's the kind of technology that, had it existed at Providence that night, would very likely have caught United 1448's wrong turn within seconds, long before it ever became a runway incursion at all. There's a broader lesson buried in all of this about how aviation safety actually improves over time. It rarely happens because of a single dramatic catastrophe forcing sweeping change overnight. More often, it happens because of exactly these kinds of near misses. Incidents where everything came uncomfortably close to disaster but didn't quite tip over the edge, giving investigators, regulators, and airlines a detailed blueprint of exactly what needs to change, without the devastating cost of an actual accident, forcing that lesson to be learned the hard way. Providence, Rhode Island, on a foggy night in December of 1999, became one small but meaningful chapter in that much larger story, a reminder that the margin between an ordinary Monday night flight and a genuine catastrophe can sometimes be measured in nothing more than a few seconds, and a single well-timed decision. What do you think you would have done in that cockpit, hearing that confusion unfold over the radio? Would you have trusted the clearance? Or would you have held your position the way that crew did? Let us know in the comments. We read every one of them. And if stories like this, the quiet near misses that never made front-page news but easily could have changed everything, are the kind of aviation history you want more of, go ahead and subscribe, because there are plenty more of these stories waiting to be told.